Good evening. We're going to start our program now. We thank you all for being here. It's so nice to have such a wonderful turnout. My name is Mark Kligman. I hold the Mickey Katz Endowed Chair in Jewish Music in the UCLA Alpert School of Music. I'm on the faculties of musicology and ethnomusicology, and I also direct the Lowell Milken Center for Music of the American Jewish Experience. It's such a pleasure to do this program tonight in this partnership we have with the Thomas Mann House. We'd like to share with you in the handout that we gave you that this is part of a series of activity that's leading up to a wonderful opera, a West Coast premiere of Schoenberg in Hollywood, a new opera written by Todd Machover, which will be at the Nimoy Theater. We have all the information there for you. We hope that you'll buy tickets and join us at the opera and tell other opera lovers. This is a wonderful opera that really explores Schoenberg's identity and his time in Los Angeles. This production that we're doing of Schoenberg is all part of the sesquicentennial, the 150th birthday anniversary. We're at the tail end of that for Schoenberg, but it coincides with this year, which is the sesquicentennial, 150th anniversary of Thomas Mann. So we thought it was all too important to talk about the relationship of these two very important émigrés to America and the artistic creations that they created. And as I said, we have this wonderful partnership. This whole project was really conceived together, and I'm very pleased to introduce to you the director of the Thomas Mann House, Benno Hertz.
Thank you so much, Mark. It is also my pleasure to welcome you here to the UCLA Faculty Club for tonight's event. My name is Benno Hertz, and I'm the program director at the Thomas Mann House, and we're the co-organizers of tonight's program. And for those of you who are not familiar with our institution, the Thomas Mann House is the former exile home of the German writer and Nobel laureate Thomas Mann. In Pacific Palisades, Mann lived there with his family from 1942 to 1952, having migrated here to Los Angeles after fleeing Nazi Germany. Mann was a vocal opponent to the Nazi Party in the early 1930s. He was stripped of his German citizenship and immigrated to the United States in 1939, following the German occupation of Czechoslovakia. And it was in fact 80 years ago to the day, on May 8, 1945, that Germany's unconditional surrender was finalized and ended World War II in Europe. At this time, the west side of Los Angeles, and specifically the Pacific Palisades, was teeming with other European émigrés and exiles, such as the philosophers Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer, Alma Mahler-Werfel, writers like Leon Feuchtwanger and Vicky Baum, and of course Arnold Schoenberg, just to name a few. And these artists and writers would go on to really change the cultural landscape of this city. And the Thomas Mann House today is building on that legacy and history of exile, offering a residency program for journalists, scholars, and academics that stay with us at the house, and then we offer events at the house. And if it wasn't for the horrible events of last January, we would be all engaging in this conversation in Thomas Mann's living room right now. As many of you know, the Thomas Mann House, as well as our sister institution, Villa Aurora, the former home of the novelist Leon Feuchtwanger and his wife Martha, rather miraculously survived the Palisades fire, but the houses were still very much affected by the smoke and the debris. Many of our neighbors and community members weren't as lucky as we were and lost their homes and belongings. So we hope once we're able to safely return to the Mann House, we can once again open our doors to them and to many of you as we strive to provide a supportive and inclusive space for our community, especially in these challenging times. If everything goes as planned, we will be able to return to the house in June and celebrate what would be Thomas Mann's 150th birthday on June 6th with a house concert and a recital from his music novel Dr. Faustus, about which I'm sure we will hear more tonight. And get invitations, please visit our website. There is a QR code by the check-in counter, as well as free Thomas Mann anniversary posters if you would like to have one of those. I would also like to use this opportunity to cordially thank our partners and colleagues here at UCLA, especially the Lowell Milken Center for Music of American Jewish Experience, the Alpert School of Music, and the UCLA Department of European Languages and Transcultural Studies. We are deeply grateful and appreciate the strong institutional ties, the many meaningful programs and events, and your support of Villa Aurora and Thomas Mann House during and after the January fires. Thank you for hosting this event here on your beautiful campus in the wake of such a difficult time. I'm delighted that we have such acclaimed speakers and presenters and performers here with us tonight. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. And I have now the pleasure of introducing our insightful moderator, Lily Hirsch. Lily Hirsch is a musicologist with a PhD from Duke University and a writer in residence at California State University, Bakersfield. She is the author of 8 books, including A Jewish Orchestra in Nazi Germany, Musical Politics and the Berlin Jewish Cultural League, Anneliese Landau's Life in Music, Nazi Germany to Émigré, California, Can't Stop the Girls, Confronting Sexist Labels in Music from Ariana Grande to Yoko Ono in 2023, and most recently, Taking Funny Music Seriously, among others. I'm also honored that Lily contributed to our volume, Thomas Mann's Los Angeles, Stories from Exile, with a wonderful piece on composer Alma Mahler-Werfel. So please welcome together with me, Lily, and our speakers.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. That was lovely. And good evening. It's a pleasure to be here in LA for this event. Can everyone hear me okay? Wonderful. I'll be your moderator tonight, introducing our featured panelists in a moment. After they each give short introductory looks at various aspects of our topic, Arnold Schoenberg and Thomas Mann in Hollywood, I'll help further conversation, first among the panelists, and then with questions from the audience before we get to hear a short musical performance. To make sure we have time for a lovely conversation, I am prepared to cut people off with the ruthlessness of a musicologist who goes to the gym sometimes. We have 3 panelists tonight: Hans Rudolf Vage, Alex Ross, and Doris Berger. Hans is professor of German Studies and Comparative Literature at Smith College, and his work focuses on Richard Wagner and Thomas Mann. He is the author of the book Thomas Mann, Der Amerikaner. He also is one of the editors of a new edition of Mann's Works and Letters. Since 1996, Alex Ross has been the music critic of The New Yorker, with articles that have focused on Thomas Mann and LA's émigré community, as well as some of my personal favorites about women composers like émigré Alma Mahler-Werfel. He has written the books Wagnerism, Art and Politics in the Shadow of Music, and The Rest is Noise, Listening to the 20th Century, a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. Doris Berger is the Vice President of Curatorial Affairs at the Academy Museum of Motion Pictures in Los Angeles. She put together the touring exhibition Light and Noir, Exiles and Émigrés in Hollywood, 1933 to 1950 at the Skirball. She also wrote the book Projected Art History, Biopics, Celebrity Culture, and the Popularizing of American Art. Our featured performer, who you'll see in a bit, is Ina Folix, who is professor of piano and head of piano here at UCLA. Her new memoir, Weight in the Fingertips, a musical odyssey from Soviet Ukraine to the world stage, was published in October 2023. To begin, I will pass the baton to Hans for his remarks.
Thank you for your kind words. Can you all hear me? Yes. What I want to do here is to take a closer look at the Schoenberg-Mann controversy. Back in Germany, Arnold Schoenberg and Thomas Mann were well aware of each other's existence, but seemed to never have met. In 1920, Mann heard Schoenberg's mighty Gurrelieder and was duly impressed. Both became members of the Prussian Academy of the Arts in Berlin, but developed no personal relationship. This changed when both, having left Germany in 1933, fetched up in Los Angeles. They were introduced at Vicky Baum's house on April 6, 1938, when Mann first set foot in California. They met again in 1940 at one of Salka Viertel's soirees. After the Manns settled in Pacific Palisades in 1942, they saw each other more frequently. Mann approached Schoenberg as he was getting ready to write Dr. Faustus, the tragic story of a German avant-garde composer named Adrian Leverkühn. He pressed Schoenberg for information about the life of the modern musician. Schoenberg welcomed the attention and suggested that they get together more regularly, which they did. They hosted each other for dinner on 2 occasions. Schoenberg, happy to advise Mann, gave him a copy of his theory of harmony and his oratorio, Die Jakobsleiter. Things appeared to be going swimmingly until in 1947, the novel appeared. By that time, Mann had committed what Schoenberg viewed as a grave offense. He had engaged as his musical advisor a youngish advocate of the musical avant-garde by the name of Theodor Adorno, who was the author of a profound study of the philosophy of new music. This was awkward in the extreme because Schoenberg disliked Adorno and withheld approval of the latter's study. But that self-appointed arbiter of modern music had in fact helped Mann flesh out the 2 culminating compositions of his fictitious composer, namely an oratorio on the theme of the apocalypse and a symphonic cantata on the theme of Dr. Faustus, based not on Goethe, but on the original version of the myth in which Faustus is condemned to hell. Mann's fictitious composer, driven by a Faustian ambition, enters a pact with the devil when he intentionally contracts syphilis to enhance artistic genius. Leverkühn's Apocalypse oratorio is written in the freely atonal style, while the symphonic cantata employs a strict version of the 12-tone technique in analogy to the historical progression of Schoenberg's own work. How Leverkühn arrives at the innovative technique is shown in a brilliant chapter in which he demonstrates the historical inevitability of dodecaphonic music. Because in that crucial chapter, there is no reference to himself, Schoenberg, the actual pioneer of 12-tone music, was deeply upset. Over the next 3 years, Schoenberg and Mann exchanged public and private statements, some indignant, some good-natured. The exchange has its share of tragic and comic moments. In the intellectual hothouse of Weimar on the Pacific, it became its biggest cause célèbre. At the heart of the matter lies the question of intellectual property. Out of respect for Schoenberg's genuinely existential anxiety about his place in the pantheon of music, Mann agreed to attach to all future editions of the novel an 8-line note informing the reader that, quote, "The method of composition presented in chapter 22, known as the 12-tone technique, is in truth the intellectual property of a contemporary composer and theoretician, Arnold Schoenberg." He added that Dr. Faustus is, quote, "indebted in many details to Schoenberg's theory of harmony." Mann made these concessions reluctantly, as one can tell from the opening words of his note. It does not seem superfluous to inform the reader, etc., etc. In fact, he believed the opposite, that the note was superfluous. Regarding intellectual property, the 2 men were miles apart. Appearances to the contrary notwithstanding, Schoenberg adhered to a pre-modern concept of the artist and of artistic creation, imbuing both with deeply religious meaning. Mann, by comparison, was an agnostic. Like Bertolt Brecht, he admitted to, quote, "a fundamental laxity in matters of intellectual property." Nor did he set great store by invention. He rather defined the task of the writer as one of finding the appropriate topical material and making it his own by transforming it and giving it new meaning. The true crux of the matter, however, lies elsewhere. If we read the novel as an allegory, as I believe we are meant to do, we are confronted with a troubling conceptual conundrum involving the question of anti-Semitism. Mann was struggling to overcome his deep-seated bias without ever fully succeeding. As an allegory, Dr. Faustus reminds us of the unholy role of culture in Germany's own pact with the devil. A keen observer of the musical scene, Mann detected an analogy between the world of German music and German history itself. After World War I, prominent figures claimed the global supremacy of German culture. Schoenberg predicted in 1920 that 12-tone music would secure the supremacy of German music for another 100 years. Likewise, Leverkühn, his fictitious composer, Leverkühn aspires to musical supremacy, giving in to his infernal inner voice, which tells him, "You will lead, you will set the march for the future." Mann's thinking about musical nationalism was closer to Paul Becker's than to Schoenberg's. At the time Schoenberg made his prediction, Becker published an essay entitled Die Weltgeltung der deutschen Musik, the global standing of German music, in which he warned against invoking the preeminence of German music as a brief for attempting to secure its dominance throughout the world. Most likely, Becker had Schoenberg in mind, who in 1919 proclaimed, quote, the superiority of the German nation in the field of music, and offered his own music as the most effective bulwark, quote, again, to oppose Latin and Slav hopes of hegemony. Let me conclude by taking a closer look at the above-mentioned conceptual conundrum. In Mann's novel, the striving for musical supremacy is meant to prefigure and foreshadow Germany's striving for world domination. By suggesting that 12-tone music itself is symptomatic of hegemonic intentions, not to mention the arguably totalitarian properties of its own principles, we are led to conclude that Schoenberg's 12-tone music was somehow implicated in the German catastrophe. This obviously runs counter to today's common understanding of German history. To think of Schoenberg, a Jew and a victim of German fascism, as its unwitting harbinger strikes us as a highly jarring notion. But what may strike us as absurd was in Mann's mind anything but absurd. Indeed, in the novel's portrayal of Munich's intellectual scene, a slick proto-fascist Jew seems to be setting the tone. What's more, Mann came to believe that Schoenberg himself was not immune to certain fascist tendencies. He refused to endorse Schoenberg's four-point plan to save the Jewish people expressly because of what he felt was its condescension to fascism. Ultimately, then, the reason Mann had no compunction to align Schoenberg with fascism was this. He perceived him not primarily as a Jewish composer, but as an emphatically German composer bent on securing the supremacy of German music. That's all I have to say at this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Hans. Next, you will get to hear from Alex Ross.
It's wonderful to be here. Thank you so much for inviting us all. So I suppose I will speak a little bit more from the Schoenberg side of things. What strikes me about Dr. Faustus, to begin with, is that the composer depicted there in his works crosses a very wide stylistic spectrum, and some of these works remind one of Stravinsky, others Alban Berg, Mahler. Some have a kind of avant-garde quality that don't resemble any of the music being written at the time, except for very occasional electronic experimental works. And so Schoenberg is part of a wider picture of 20th century music, in my view. But for the purposes of our discussion, I want to zero in on Schoenberg's time in Hollywood and his attitude toward American culture and Hollywood film in particular. I think something that Schoenberg and Mann had in common, despite some obvious differences, was an enthusiasm for film. Both were great fans of Charlie Chaplin. Both went to the movies sort of more casually than seriously. There's in Thomas Mann's diaries, there are all these wonderful brief reviews of films that he went to see at the Fox Theater here in Wedgwood, Westwood, among other places. And Schoenberg, too, had his film enthusiasms. At the same time, he was quite skeptical of how film music was being handled in the early sound era. There's a fascinating essay that he wrote for California Arts and Architecture, which was the magazine edited by John and Tenzo, which became the sort of clearinghouse for ideas about modernist architecture, and the case study program was unfolded in its pages. But it also had a lot of very interesting commentary on music and other arts. And so in 1940, Schoenberg wrote an essay called Art and the Moving Pictures, in which he said that he was very disappointed by the quality of music that was heard in the early sound era. He writes, I had dreamed of a dramatization of Balzac's Seraphita, or Strindberg's To Damascus, or the second part of Goethe's Faust, or even Wagner's Parsifal. All of these works, by renouncing the law of unity of space and time, would have found the solution to realization in sound pictures. But the industry continued to satisfy only the needs and demands of the ordinary people who filled their theaters. There can and must be founded a production of plays and operas to justify the demands of the more highly educated, plus the demands of art. I do not assume that the industry, which at present produces moving pictures, could or cares to start such a turn towards pure art. This could only be done by men who had not used their talents in the opposite direction. This can only be done by new men. So this sounds a bit severe, perhaps, in its attitude towards Hollywood, but at the same time, Schoenberg, as a teacher and as a member of the Los Angeles community, had many, many relationships with people in the film world. He became friends with Charlie Chaplin. He knew several of the Marx Brothers. He famously played tennis with George Gershwin, whose early death in 1937 struck him as a very heavy blow. And he taught a number of composers who were active in film. Among them, David Raksin, Franz Waxman, Alfred Newman, Oscar Levant, who wasn't a film composer exactly, but was, of course, very active in the Hollywood world, and Leonard Rosenman. Now, a number of these composers came to Schoenberg perhaps with the early expectation that he would instruct them in the use of dissonance, atonality, sort of in order to enable them to write music effectively for scenes involving action, mayhem, horror, what have you. This was not something that Schoenberg was interested in doing. In fact, his lessons avoided generally the whole topic of atonality and 12-tone music. He was very intent on imparting a basic grounding, a thorough grounding in harmony and counterpoint in the classical tradition. Often students would end up begging him to say something about, say, the 12-tone method, which he would very reluctantly agree to do. If occasionally one of these film composers would approach him with a sort of request for help writing something dissonant and expressionistic, he could become quite annoyed. David Raksin told me the story of how he once asked Schoenberg how he would write music for a sequence involving airplanes. And Schoenberg, perhaps with certainly with irony and perhaps a bit of annoyance, said, "Like big bees, only louder." So that was the extent of his device. advice. But nonetheless, the composers got a great deal from these lessons. Many of Schoenberg's students went on to the worlds of popular music as well. He had a number of followers in the jazz world who paid very close attention to his teachings and to his ideas. And so I think the idea that Schoenberg was exclusively a conduit for the great Germanic tradition is contradicted by the reality of the influence that he had in American life, especially in the last part of his life. Just to close, I thought we'd play a little bit of music, which I'm not going to identify beforehand, and then sort of afterwards, perhaps someone can make a guess as to what it is. Can we hear the music? So does anyone recognize it, possibly? Yes?
Leonard Rosenman.
Yes, exactly. Yes. Leonard Rosenman, this is from the planetarium scene in Rebel Without a Cause. Rosenman was a Schoenberg student. Not at the time he was writing for film. That came later. Obviously, this is music, in the Schoenberg mold, very much influenced by his voice. And the amazing thing is to think about sort of the millions of people who've seen this movie, who know nothing about Schoenberg, and many of them in the concert hall, if they were to encounter Schoenberg's music, might be quite alarmed or bewildered. But in the world of film, they don't even think twice about it. It seems perfectly natural in the dramatic context. And so there's so much that depends on the frame in which music such as this is presented to us. Alien in a certain kind of 19th century style concert hall, absolutely natural in the world of Hollywood film, and that's one of the enigmas that govern the reception of 20th century music, modern music, throughout the years. So with that, I will hand it over to Doris.
Yes, yes, take it away, Doris.
Okay. Thank you so much. All right, let's start with Thomas Mann. It might sound surprising, and we heard that a little bit already, that Thomas Mann really enjoyed going to the movies. He made multiple entries, over 50 entries in his diary, that he went to the movie theaters right here in Westwood, as well as meeting Hollywood dignitaries, so to speak. The Nobel Prize-winning author was a welcomed guest in Hollywood, in particular during their month-long trip in spring in 1938. Beneficial to the Hollywood connections at that time were also his relationship to Liesl and Bruno Frank, who were neighbors of the Manns in Munich and who were already living here in Hollywood and Los Angeles at the time. They introduced Katja and Thomas Mann to many exiles and émigrés in Hollywood. Another level of involvement with the European film community was fostered by the European Film Fund that was co-founded by the Franks as well. In October of 1938, the non-profit organization called European Film Fund was founded by talent agent Paul Kohner, actress Charlotte Dietele, and Liesl Frank, alongside other émigré filmmakers. Their goal, the goal of the EFF, of the European Film Fund, was, I quote, to collect money from all European film people here in Hollywood according to their means and distribute the money to European film people here in Hollywood now in distress and who don't earn a living. This initiative was of great importance and a great support mechanism that was created by and for this community. They would sign on director Ernst Lubitsch as its president, and Paul Kohner provided his talent agency as its headquarters. The European Film Fund offered instrumental support to many exiled writers, in fact, also some actors and directors in Hollywood during 1938 until 1945. While Thomas Mann was not a co-founder of the European Film Fund, he became an important supporter, in particular to help his brother Heinrich Mann, after the Warner Brothers contract that he helped negotiate for Heinrich was not extended. In addition to Thomas Mann's philanthropic activities, he was connecting with Hollywood shakers and movers to see if a film adaptation of one of his works might be a possibility. During this month-long visit in spring of 1938, he had lots of meetings. It's actually dizzying to read how many meetings he had. I get really exhausted just thinking about this. Because he had lots of meetings, went to private screenings, visited Paramount, MGM, and Disney studios, all that in just 1 month. Let me share a few of those gatherings that I found significant for our discussion here, illustrating the interwovenness of his support for exiles and émigrés alongside trying to do business and discuss ideas for a film adaptation. In March 31st, 1938, Jack Warner from Warner Brothers hosted a dinner party in honor of Thomas Mann at his mansion in Bel Air for a $100 per plate to benefit German refugees. The guests at this evening were Ernst Lubitsch, the Dieterles, the Franks, Irving Berlin, Oscar Hammerstein, Edward G. Robinson, James Cagney, Miriam Hopkins, Dorothy Parker, and many more. A few days later, on April 3rd, 1938, the Manns were invited at the Franks to a garden party together with Max Reinhardt, Karl Laemmle, and Ernst Lubitsch. There's actually a photo of that moment. And this was most likely also the moment where Mann talked to the Universal Studio founder, Karl Laemmle, about an adaptation of his Joseph trilogy. On April 6, only 3 days later, writer Vicky Baum, and you mentioned it before, invited the Manns to her home in Amalfi Drive, very close by to where they would end up living eventually, where he met the architect Richard Neutra, conductor Otto Klemperer, and composer Arnold Schoenberg. And on April 12th, he went on a film set to see at MGM to see Robert Montgomery in action, so to speak, because he wanted to have him as his main actor for his Joseph film. A few days later, he met Adrian, who was the MGM costume designer, and they also discussed the potential Joseph project. And then on April 19th, 1938, finally there was a soiree at the Dieterles in Hollywood where they screened Dieterles' film The Story of Louis Pasteur from 1935 with Paul Muni in the main role. Schoenberg was actually also invited to that evening. All these encounters, and there were more, during this trip as well as a trip in 1939 happened while Thomas Mann still held his professorship at Princeton. He enjoyed his visits with the movie Gesindel, the movie riffraff as it's translated, and was hopeful that a film adaptation of his Joseph trilogy, potentially directed by Willem Dieterle, would become reality. Strangely enough, Mann's manifold connections to Hollywood that he developed during these visits would become less strong once he moved to Los Angeles in 1942, and his Joseph film did not materialize. And he would focus more on his radio speeches as well as his novel Dr. Faustus. And now coming to Schoenberg, while I'm not going deeper into that complicated relationship that we heard more about earlier, I wanted to look at Arnold Schoenberg's connection to Hollywood, or rather his disconnection with it. Schoenberg settled with his family in Los Angeles in 1934. Only a year later, in November of 1935, Schoenberg met with MGM production head Irving Thalberg and was connected through Salka Viertel. Salka Viertel at the time connected everybody in the exile community. She was the salonière, la grande dame of Hollywood and the exile community, and she recommended Schoenberg apparently to Thalberg. Thalberg was at the height of his career, the production prince, as he was often coined, at MGM, and invited Schoenberg to compose the music for a screen adaptation of the book The Good Earth. A few misunderstandings ensued. According to Salka Viertel's memoirs, Thalberg asked Schoenberg to write music for his film after hearing the lovely music he has written. And Schoenberg responded, apparently, "I don't write lovely music." Despite not being fully in tune with one another, they went ahead to pursue this collaboration, and Schoenberg wrote some sketches for it that we have the pleasure to hear right now with Ina Falk's very short sketches.
So the world premiere.
Thank you so much, Ina. It's amazing to imagine what it would have been like to have Schoenberg's scoring in the film The Good Earth. There would have been like, says, it did not happen, right? That's why those are only sketches. What happened was that Erwin Thalberg proposed a substantial fee to Arnold Schoenberg of $30,000, which was really high at the time for a composer's fee. And Schoenberg countered and asked for $50,000. And most importantly, he wanted artistic control. Control also over the actors, which is totally unheard of in Hollywood at that time and even now. So it kind of ended that collaboration abruptly. Ultimately, Herbert Stothard was hired as the composer, but what I find interesting, and I want to share a few more moments, if there is enough time about, no, not so much, okay, about The Good Earth, because it was a production that was a real big epic production, a Chinese epic story, released in 1937 that received great critical success. It received 5 Oscar nominations, for Best Picture included, and had 2 wins for émigrés. One for Louise Reiner as Best Actress, and another one for Carl Freund's cinematography. However, the production proved really, really difficult and lost MGM lots of money. So the challenges with Schoenberg were not the only challenges of that film. It started with, MGM started to work on this film in 1933, and apparently 20 writers were hired to adapt the stage version to a film script. Irving Thalberg, who was known for producing sophisticated stories for the big screen for MGM, he was behind Ben-Hur, Mata Hari, A Night at the Opera, and so on and so forth, was in control of this and wanted first an old Chinese cast. It did not happen that way. And there's a lot of stories why. One, the director, George Hill, went to China for research, but committed suicide before the film got off the ground. Victor Fleming was hired to direct after that, but then he had to quit of sudden illness. And finally, Sidney Franklin finished the film. Towards the end of the production, and most tragically, also Irving Thalberg died. So he did not see the film finished. And Al Lewin finished the movie. And the film at the end would have a dedication to Thalberg, actually. The production was made really with good intentions towards authenticity regarding representing Chinese culture. They hired also a technical advisor with General Ting Chu Tu, helping the writing team to steer away from demeaning caricatures in storytelling. Nevertheless, it fell into some pitfalls of now seen as racist casting practices. While they hired a lot of Chinese actors in supporting roles and extras, they did not follow through that with the main protagonists. And it's peculiar because a lot of European Jewish actors were hired for this production, such as German Jewish émigré Louise Reiner, Austrian Jewish émigré Paul Muni were hired to play the main characters. This is particularly surprising because Anna May Wong, a then famous Chinese actress, was really interested in playing that role, but was only offered a smaller part as a concubine, which she declined, and which ended up to the Austrian Jewish émigré actress, dancer, choreographer Tilly Losch. It is interesting, as I mentioned, that so many actors of Jewish European descent were hired to play the key roles in this film that depicts Chinese society. Considering this fact, reaching out to Schoenberg would have been in line in Thalberg's approach for this film. Overall, as we all know, and to closing remarks here, Schoenberg never felt fully respected in Hollywood as well as in the movie, in the music industry field, I would say. But as Alex mentioned, Schoenberg was actually quite successful indirectly in Hollywood through the people he taught. And we can talk a little bit more about that. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, all of you. Okay, from this opening, we see a bit about Mann and Schoenberg's relationship, as well as their complicated relationship to Hollywood. Mann, for his part, was clearly fascinated and enjoyed going to see films, including Disney films like Snow White and Bambi 2 times. He also entertained the idea of adapting his novels, though he left behind comments that film is inferior to literature. In a letter to his son, he characterized Hollywood as preferable to the, quote, scholarly atmosphere back at Princeton, end quote. But when he attended the fundraising event at Jack Warner's home, which Doris mentioned, he would describe the house as, quote, pompous. To quote a famous film title, it's complicated. Sorry. Schoenberg had his own issues with Hollywood, though he taught film composers, as we've heard, and knew Charlie Chaplin. While he criticized film in Art and the Moving Picture, which Alex cited, he also imagined a school for sound man and agreed to present the Academy Award for Best Film Score of 1937. As for his almost collaboration with Thalberg, he left behind a record of relief, but also lingering hope when he hadn't heard from Thalberg after their meeting, writing, quote, "I wanted to ask you to give me your decision, or at least to write me a letter," end quote. To me, it's a classic grasping freelancer follow-up. With these contested actions and comments in mind, I would like to open up our conversation by getting a bit more context, more insight into the music hierarchies of the day and Hollywood's place in that, which impacted Mann and Schoenberg's attitudes here. When I worked on my book about Anneliese Landau, an émigré herself, it became clear from her memoirs that LA to many emigres was a wasteland, a cultural wasteland of sorts, a place with very little high art. How could that change of context have impacted Schoenberg and Mann's view of film music once here in LA? I thought perhaps Doris or Alex could start us off with some context about the place of film music and music in LA more generally during Mann and Schoenberg's day.
Well, the music world in LA was not really competitive with the East Coast, but the LA Philharmonic under Klemperer, Otto Klemperer, who came here in 1933 already, had made great strides. And of course, he was one of the great conductors of the day, was quite progressive in his programming, even though the board of the orchestra resisted quite a few of his suggestions. Nonetheless, Schoenberg was heard, Hindemith was heard, quite a bit of Stravinsky was played at the LA Philharmonic in these years. Nonetheless, Schoenberg, I think understandably, grew frustrated that when the LA Phil played his music, it was more his arrangements of Bach or his famous orchestral arrangement of the Brahms G minor piano quartet, or of course the lovely early works for clarinet, rather than his most recent pieces, the big pieces such as the violin concerto, the piano concerto. But I do not have the impression that Schoenberg saw Los Angeles as a wasteland. That term does appear very often. Klemperer actually used it over and over in his early letters to his wife after arriving here, die Wüste. Schoenberg, ironically, was in the middle of writing and would not finish an opera about Moses going into the desert and embracing the desert as a place where he could be nearer to God. You could make the rather kind of roundabout argument that Los Angeles was the desert in which he arrived and, if not thrived, made his home here. Whatever resistance he encountered in LA and the sort of broader national American music market, nonetheless, he made his home here. He put down roots. He was determined that his children would have American childhoods. We are honored to have Larry Schoenberg with us today. And just adapted to Los Angeles life in all kinds of ways, small and big. I don't think ultimately he was terribly disappointed by his failure to sort of get anywhere in the film business. The one comment that he made to Alma Mater Werfel was that he was relieved, in fact, that it hadn't turned out well, and he said it would have been the end of me or something. And the price that he was demanding was so exorbitant that it was just really out of the question. I mean, I was looking up on my notes. Erich Wolfgang Korngold was making sort of $8,000 to $12,000 per movie in this period, 1938, later, for Adventures of Robin Hood. And he was the top of the line. He was the leading film composer of the day. So $50,000, that was really out of the question. But yeah, as I've talked about, he had this decisive influence on film nonetheless, and remains a strong presence, I think, in the world of film today. We just can't imagine whole genres of pictures without a Schoenbergian vocabulary on the soundtrack.
Yeah, thank you. Related, Hans, I was wondering if you could comment specifically on Mann's Americanization and attitudes towards LA or Disney specifically, or Doris.
He was fascinated by the Disney movies. This fascination continued with Bambi, but from the notes from the comments that we have in his diary, we can't really tell what exactly it was that fascinated him. We mustn't forget that Thomas Mann was not a cineast. He was a writer who from the get-go, from the beginning, from the very first time we went to the movies, was convinced that it was an inferior medium. And he never gave up this position. Nonetheless, he was interested particularly in film adaptations of contemporary American novels. He went to all the Steinbeck adaptations, for instance, and there we have there are some notes of admiration and satisfaction about the way Hollywood handled Steinbeck novels. Beyond that, did you say the Americanization of Thomas Mann?
Yeah.
Zero.
Perfect. Thank you. It's just what I was looking for. As in the new opera we are looking forward to, it is fun to imagine how Schoenberg and Mann would have done if they had been more directly, professionally involved in film. To do that, I wanted to ask Doris a bit more about the filmmaking process, the cooperation these two would have had to figure out.
Oh my God.
I warn you.
It's hard to imagine them in a filmmaking universe, in particular, not independent filmmaking, but in particular Hollywood industrialized filmmaking, I should say, where it's like a fleeceband type of situation, right? You have a job as a screenwriter, you write your dialogues from 9 to 5, more or less. You have lots of dialogues with other writers. You have to work with other writers. They go over your notes again and again. So there's artistic integrity. I don't know if that exists necessarily for a writer. Hard to imagine. That's why it's also so fascinating that other émigrés, for example, Billy Wilder, adapted much easier. He also started as a screenwriter and then became a director, and and he started as a journalist back in Berlin, actually. So like fast writing, I would say, and dialogistic writing, and having interactions with another writer was more his field. It's not the case for Thomas Mann at all, as far as I know, and that's why it's very hard to imagine Thomas Mann writing a script, actually. You might know better if that would have been possible.
Well, he contemplated a project called The Return of Ulysses. This was at the time when Greece was occupied by Italy, by the fascist forces of Italy, and all the anti-fascist community around the world was, of course, rooting for Greece, and at that point he conceived a film. It was not a script; it was an idea. That's what it was. A scenario. And the clue. The kicker of the story was there was a false news announcement on the radio that Hitler was dead, which then started all the resistance coming forward and so on. And this story was aligned to the return of Ulysses back to Ithaca and taking revenge. So nothing came of this. And there was another one. I think you want to say something about
Oh, yeah, the woman with 100 faces. This was an idea that he started working on with the novelist Louis Bromfield, which didn't get very far along before he completely lost interest in it. And he ended up having Bruno Frank ghostwrite his portion of the project. But it was an interesting story about a famous model for painters, Picasso among others. It would have been a story told from different perspectives, somewhat in the style of Citizen Kane, which is a movie he went to see and admired very much. And astonishingly, the idea was that Thomas Mann himself would appear on screen telling parts of the story along with Louis Bromfield, which is very difficult to imagine, but also tantalizing, and introducing Thomas Mann. The funny thing with Schoenberg is sort of listening to that music, it does not seem so wildly improbable that Schoenberg, through some lucky chain of circumstances and with the right collaborator, the right director, could have written a film score that would have been quite effective. I think we can hear a flexibility there, not the sort of dogmatic insistence on, there's only one true way forward from music. You'll hear him playing around with something that sounds much more like Bartók, this kind of sort of modal, sort of modal composition, and then this rather lush, romantic Liebesmotiv music. You can sort of picture it possibly happening, but it would have taken a really freak chain of events to sort of make it possible, plus a lot of money, of course.
I'm so glad you brought us back to Schoenberg, because in our preliminary talk about this event, Alex, you offered a specific take on how you imagine Schoenberg would have done in the collaborative process that all would have required. And I very much enjoyed the frank assessment, so I'm going to ask you very innocently, do you think Schoenberg would have been a good collaborator?
Well, in a way, sort of, film composition doesn't require collaboration per se. You sort of sit down and write the music. You have very little time. There are very strict parameters. And then the producer may come in and say, "So that's all wrong. I want something different." But it's done quickly at the last stage of the process. So you don't need this kind of sustained working relationship with a screenwriter, with a director, and so on. And so for that reason, I can imagine sort of Schoenberg working in isolation as was his sort of comfort zone as a composer, nonetheless producing something. Schoenberg was also, contrary to this personality of Adrian Leverkuhn in the novel, a very outgoing, sociable man, passionate in his enthusiasms, willing to sort of strike out conversations with sort of anyone who crossed his path. They didn't need to be a sort of distinguished fellow émigré. Larry was telling me that he sort of grew up with this idea that, the heroes around him in the neighborhood were the milkman, because the milkman did his job so thoroughly and so punctiliously, and he was a hero of discipline and hard work, and the mailman and so on. So there was a broadness to Schoenberg's social vision, which wouldn't rule out this kind of collaboration. But in the end, when it came to the notes, it had to be done his way. He wasn't going to let anyone tell him to sort of change to a kind of brighter mood or what have you.
Right, but I appreciate that kind of flipping of what our expectations of Schoenberg, and that brings me to a question that for anyone here. What do people typically get wrong about Schoenberg and Mann when we talk about film music and their relationship to Hollywood? Because I know there are a lot of misconceptions here. What kind of teacher he was, if he was a difficult teacher, or I came across some mention that people took lessons with Schoenberg because he was a curiosity, but that might not be right.
Well, Schoenberg, he was a fantastic teacher. He could be very strict. He could be, his sense of humor was a very sort of classic Viennese sense of humor, and it could sort of hit quite sharply. Sometimes there's a famous story where someone was writing a piece that had a little too much kind of galloping rhythm, and in the middle of the piece, while it was being played, he called out, "Hi-yo, Silver!" So there was a sharp wit. He could be strict, but he was also so involved in his students' lives. He just didn't care what style they were composing in. It was about whatever style they chose, were they doing it to the best of its, sort of, were they realizing its possibility in the best way. And so you have a long string of his students, including John Cage, who went in a completely different direction, speaking very highly not only of Schoenberg as a teacher, but as a model for a kind of ethical way of living one's life and devoting oneself to one's work. A great deal of warmth and just above all passion, involvement in the act of teaching. He wouldn't sort of give the same exams. Anyone who teaches classes might be shocked to hear this. Not only would he not sort of hand out the same exams every year, he would tailor each exam to the abilities of the students. So we'd write different exams for the different students in his class. That's a lot of extra work. But this was his attitude toward teaching.
And I believe he also taught artistic integrity, which is a big thing to teach. You know, it's a big gift.
Yeah, that's great. I wanted to ask, going back to Mann, what we can learn about Mann and film. I know several of you have seen these entries, these kind of mini music reviews or film reviews. What can we learn from these entries, mentioning his visits to cinema and offering remarks about particular films? Is there any insight into Mann as a writer or his attitudes towards America or Hollywood?
Sure. What comes to the fore in some of his comments on the movies that he had just watched, and this includes not only Hollywood movies but also German movies. What comes to the fore is his natural inclination to let his same-sex desires be the judge of things. He clearly reacted to the depiction, to the representation of the male body, the naked male body. That is quite clear. At one point he says, commenting on a German film of about 1932, he said, that is the strength of German films. The homosexual tendency, the homosexual drill of the movies that he had seen, and he continued this interest. He kept it alive in Hollywood. He does make comments about the look of male actors. He was, at this fabulous dinner in 1938 that Jack Warner arranged for him, this fundraising dinner. There were several big A-list names there, ladies, leading actresses. There's no comment on this. There is.
Interesting.
It's unimaginable that they wouldn't have had some kind of exchange. But one has to bear in mind that in the spring of 1938, Thomas Mann's English was not really good enough to have a conversation in English. He preferred to talk to people who spoke German.
Yeah.
So that is regrettable, because I have imagined myself at that dinner several times, and I would have liked to know what they ate and what they drank and who talked with whom, etc., etc. We don't know much. It's not even in his diary. Because it passed him by, which, by the way, Thomas Mann's diary as a source is, if I may say so, overrated. It's unreliable, because very often during his American years, very often he didn't grasp something, and then it doesn't appear in the diary, but we know from other sources that he was at such and such a place and that he had such and such a conversation. So it's, of course, the diary is invaluable, but it is not the last word.
Oh, fascinating.
I have to throw in from the diaries the praise for the constantly exposed, magnificent torso of Marlon Brando in Street of Desire.
Right, yeah.
Well, who can blame him there?
And Mann would have been a great topic, I think, for Laura Mulvey in the 70s, who wrote feminist film theory, visual pleasure, narrative cinema. I think that is exactly what Thomas Mann experienced. Not a cinephile, but he experienced the pleasure in the gaze.
This is our next panel topic. I think I'm allowed one more question, and then we have to open up from questions from the audience. So I wanted to ask, and this would be from anyone, a lot of émigrés found a home in Hollywood. How do you think the experience that Mann and Schoenberg had here as émigrés differed from or compared to the experience of other émigrés?
Well, I think in both instances, for Thomas Mann had means, many émigré writers, some immigrant writers did not have means, and had a really hard time adapting to this culture, writing in a different language. Thomas Mann's book were already translated into English at that time, so he was not dependent on Hollywood's contract. So his experience was very different than Döblin's or Polga's, or even his brother's Heinrich Mann's experience here. That was very difficult, to devastating, actually. And in the other way around, in terms of composer, I think if we compare with Max Steiner, who came earlier, but who was really famous at Warner Brothers, Erich Wolfgang Korngold, Franz Waxman, they all had substantial careers in Hollywood, while they also wrote operas, some of them. Very different situation than Arnold Schoenberg's.
Yes, although, I mean, Schoenberg was the most celebrated living composer and remains so. While he was in Los Angeles, there were financial struggles, particularly after he was forced into retirement from UCLA, which he did not want to do. He wanted to continue teaching. But nonetheless, he was not facing the kind of desperation that many other émigrés really had to contend with, including some composers. I mean, there are composers like Paul Dessau or Ernst Toch, who had deeply frustrating experiences with Hollywood and in general with the sort of state of their careers here, and felt overlooked and neglected, which Schoenberg was simply not the case with Schoenberg. And then just to think of all the hundreds of others, the actors who ended up having to play bit roles as Gestapo agent number 2 in films, the artists, or formerly well-regarded lawyers or scientists who ended up driving cabs or working as gardeners, and so on and so forth. It was a hard life, but most of them were nonetheless grateful to be alive, to be here, and not to be back where they came from.
Yeah. Okay, I think we have a time for a ridiculously short Q&A question from the audience. Maybe we could pass around a microphone? Perfect. Okay. Anyone have any questions?
Hi. You mentioned Korngold, and I just can't help but thinking, did Korngold hear what Schoenberg had asked in terms of a fee, and how, in God's name, did he react to that?
I don't know of him receiving that information. I'm sure he would have laughed to hear it. But Korngold and Schoenberg actually were very convivial. They saw each other often. Of course, they had so much sort of history in common, despite the apparent disparity stylistically, as well as sort of their professional paths. They got along very well and regarded each other highly.
Anyone else? I think we have time for 1, 2. Okay.
Hi. So I want to talk about a novel of Thomas Mann, Death in Venice, one of my favorite novels of Thomas Mann. So in his novel, he tells about a man, also a writer, that was vacating in Venice. And this man felt absolutely liberated and uplifted, and then increasingly obsessed by the sight of a young, beautiful boy. So I was wondering, what kind of a relationship did Thomas Mann have with this figure in his book? Was he somehow touched, or how did he get to this idea of this?
We know that he did encounter a Polish boy on the Lido of Venice in 1911 when he was vacationing there with his wife and his brother, and this young man turned out to be at that time he was, I think, 14 years old, or 12 years old. This turned out to be a child of a noble family, and when somebody told him that he might have been the model for Taggio in Death in Venice, this man, whose name I can't recall now, confirmed that yes, he can remember that Thomas Mann was there. Somebody must have told him. So there was a real-life model. This is very often the case with Thomas Mann. He very often crafted his figures after real-life models, and this also applies to Taggio in Death in Venice.
Right here.
Thank you so much for this wonderful panel. I was wondering about the 12-tone music, and you were talking about the enigmas of musical reception, and that the 12-tone system can perhaps be seen as totalitarian, but can't it also be seen as utterly democratic, when every note can only appear once before another one can appear a second time?
That is a devious way of looking at it, because it also says there's no free note. You know.
I don't think the 12-tone system has any particular political relevance in one way or another. It was a way. It was very simply a way that Schoenberg came up with to organize the extreme freedom, the extreme kind of multiplicity of possibilities that he faced when he moved into what's called atonality, for better or worse, which simply means just far beyond the conventional tonal system, so many possible combinations of notes. And so this was a way of just sort of finding a path, sort of finding a thread through this labyrinth, sort of organizing music in this expanded field. And I think there's a great deal of misunderstanding about the nature of this method, how Schoenberg used it, how others misunderstood it and applied it in a much more rigid and strict way than Schoenberg ever intended, which is why I think he became reluctant to talk about the 12-tone system with pupils, because he thought it was something that was very tricky to understand, and not necessarily everyone was going to get it. The other thing about sort of 12-tone writing is you can use it to write tonal music. You know, you can arrange the row in a way that sort of produces quite lush romantic sounds, which is exactly what Alfred did in Lulu and the Violin Concerto. So it's an abstraction. I think you can assign it all different kind of allegorical meanings, but for Schoenberg, it was nothing more than a technique to make his composition easier and more logical.
Okay, I think we have time for one more final question. No pressure. Make it count.
Here, over here.
The Polish noble boy was named Vladislav Mers, and everybody who was at the beach said the same thing about it, including Thomas Mann's wife, Katya. The whole beach was looking at the boy. He was born to star in a novella.
That was short. I think we can do another. Right in the front.
So my knowledge of Mann and Heinrich and Thomas is sketchy, but my understanding was that Thomas Mann was one of the only émigrés who was actually able to write in his native language and be successful at it, because he also wrote Joseph and His Brothers when he was here in LA. And Heinrich, for example, was not able to write. I don't think Adorno wrote any. I don't know. What the writers who came here, other than Mann, who were any of them successful in what they have been doing in Germany?
Feuchtwanger, Werfel.
Franz Werfel was the great bestseller of the day. The Song of Bernadette was just enormously successful, to the point where Thomas Mann was a bit envious. But there were others, such as Döblin, Heinrich Mann's later novels. They were writing in German. There was no interest in translation, and it was quite bleak. They felt as though they were writing these books that, as long as Nazi Germany existed, were never going to be published. And so the experiences of the writers, I think, crossed the same kind of gamut as everyone else. Some were successful, some really struggled.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, round of applause. Thank you. Okay. So this concludes the question and answer portion of the evening. You all are off the hot seat. I've enjoyed being your moderator this evening, and am now thrilled to bring to the piano Ina, who will play for us Schoenberg's 3 piano pieces, Opus 11.
Thank you so much for this wonderful discussion. Can you all hear me? So I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the music you'll hear. So the penultimate question dealt very well with what you're going to hear. And these pieces, Opus 11, really map his journey to atonality. There are 3 short movements. The first is really an intermezzo of sorts, and you can hear kind of hints of a theme appearing and disappearing. The second I think of is a kind of a lilting dance, a very brooding, dark waltz. And the third, and the third is the emancipation of the dissonance, as he called it. And I wanted to read to you just a few short excerpts from a letter that Schoenberg wrote to Busoni, with whom he had a very interesting relationship. And when he wrote these pieces, Opus 11, in 1909, Busoni took it upon himself to improve Schoenberg's piano writing and write a transcription of Opus 11, number 2. And I don't think Schoenberg was thrilled about it. He was very polite in his letter and very eloquent. So I'll just read to you first a few phrases that I think describe this music beautifully, and then kind of how he thought of it and how he verbalized it to Busoni, another great innovator, composer, pianist, and many more things. So Schoenberg said, "I strive for complete liberation from all forms, away with motivic working out. Harmony is expression and nothing else. Concise, in 2 notes not built but expressed. It is impossible for a person to have only one sensation at a time. One has thousands simultaneously, and these thousands can no more readily be added together than an apple and a pear. They go their own ways." So that's very much, I think, all 3 pieces. And then he writes to Busoni, "One must have grasped, admired, and marveled at the mysterious wonders of our tonal harmony, the unbelievably delicate balance of its architectural values, its Kabbalistic mathematics, as I have, in order to feel when one no longer has the need for them, that one requires new means." And now he mentions Wagner rather interestingly. He says, "We've had enough of Wagner's full, lush sonorities to the point of satiation. And then to the point of his piano writing needing to be rewritten, he says to Busoni, I must add that I feel myself justified in believing that my piano writing is novel. Friends and pupils express the opinion that the sonorities of my piano writing are completely novel. It is not a result of incompetence, but rather the expression of firm resolve, distinct preference, and palpably clear feelings. Therefore, it is distinctive, stylish, and organic. And I think that's the word organic. To me, that's what this music is. It's all feeling. It's incredibly dramatic and passionate and powerful. It's visionary in that it's totally unpredictable. It's almost like a mirror into a subconscious. And I'm reminded of the music we heard in the beginning of the night, the film score. And I started thinking, and I've never thought of this before, how this could really work if you think of it as a film score, if you're watching something. And that was an amazing thought. So thank you, Alex, for that. So I hope you enjoyed, but I will start you off with a very tiny Wagner piece called Elegy. And this was written, I believe, in 1859. And I will go directly into the Schoenberg.
Thank you.